Hello friends, good afternoon and welcome to EduSat Live Lectures. Dear friends, today we are going to talk about problems of interpretation in Indian political thought. To discuss this topic, we have with us our subject expert, Dr. Satish Kumar Jha. Dr. Jha is Associate Professor in Department of Political Science in Aryabhat College. Dr. Jha has 25 years of teaching experience and he has an expertise in Indian political thought and political theory. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Sir to our studios and request him to start the lecture. Welcome, Sir.
Thank you. Good afternoon. In fact, today's lecture we are going to have on the problem of interpretation in political thought. And this is a kind of problem which all of us encounter when we try to interpret a text or a thinker who is not a contemporary, a thinker or contemporary text, or basically he is not, or basically the text is not the product of contemporary time. So what happens that what separate us from the text and the thinker is basically time and space, and that separation sometimes that separation becomes a kind of detriment or kind of hindrance on the path of reaching at a conclusive position or arriving at truth, or in terms of capturing the true meaning of the text and the intentions of the author. So this is what normally we understand as problem of interpretation in political thought. Now, this problem has been addressed by a number of scholars, because the creation of a text in thought is a creative act, but interpretation is a scholarly exercise. So when they basically come together, a creative act of a thinker and a scholarly act of interpreter, then this problem acquires a new dimension, that how that creativity has to be preserved and how that a scholarly exercise of interpreting that creative work has to approximate to those ideas which were being articulated in the text by the thinker, or how the interpreter can be truthful to the ideas which are there in the text, so that there is not much distortion, there is not much imputation, there is not much of subjective bias, and so on and so forth. So that's why this problem of interpretation is a very important issue in social science, in political philosophy, political theory, political science. And this problem of interpretation normally is sought to be handled with some methodological considerations, because ultimately one cannot escape reading or interpreting a text or a thinker, because we have to do it. And then of course every reader, every interpreter sometimes devises his or her own method of dealing with a text, but that is not a solution. There has to be a kind of rational, uniform perspective to deal with this problem. And this is what has been basically done in political theory and political thought over the ages, so far as this question of interpretation is concerned. Now, there is a problem, there is no denying this fact, and that is why in fact, for example, a political thinker like Plato is considered by Barker as a defender of freedom, whereas Karl Popper, another political philosopher, a commentator, a scholar on Plato, he considers him as enemy of freedom. So is the case, and in between these two interpretations of Barker and Popper, there are in fact more than 20 more interpretations about Plato. Now why is this? Because Plato has written certain texts, some texts which have acquired the status of classics, and then there are different interpretations of the same text coming from different scholars who are trying to make sense of Plato's ideas in contemporary times, and one is calling him as a defender of freedom, another is calling him enemy of freedom. For example, Isaiah Berlin gave 20 interpretations of Machiavelli, and so far as Rousseau is concerned, Chapman called him as a totalitarian, whereas for others he is a great liberal voice of 18th century. So, therefore, there is a problem. Take the example of Locke. For many scholars, researchers, interpreters, Locke is a majoritarian thinker, whereas many people would like to call him as a great protector of individual rights. So, in fact, not only one thinker, Plato, we can take endless number of examples to basically illustrate this point, that how interpretations have differed in terms of presenting a text, a scholar, their idea, the thinker in basically contemporary times before the readers, and different interpretations sometimes become highly confounding. And therefore, for readers, for a student of political science, political theory, it is important that we should know that what is the problem of interpretation, how to deal and handle a particular thinker or a text. Now, the question is that if one simply agrees with what Plato writes in Republic or what is contained in Republic, and if you go literally, then of course the problem can be minimized, but then the problem starts the moment you show some amount of skepticism or start handling it differently, and that basically gives rise to this problem of interpretation. Now, how to deal with this interpretation? This is a question which often basically stares us in the face, that how to deal with this interpretation. Of course, there are certain escape routes, all of us can adopt that escape route, but I think that is not a solution. For example, in fact, one escape route could be that you read just one interpretation and consider it as the interpretation, that there is no other opinion but there is only one opinion, whatever that text writes or what that text presents, or whatever that commentary presents on that text. So, you consider it as the interpretation, but then again this is not a solution. Similarly, you can take another measure, that consider every interpretation which is available to you as true, and in one sense in fact one can play safe, that saying that of course without taking any position, whatever interpretations are being given, all of them carry some truth and therefore all of them have to be accepted, but many people believe that this is basically not fair in social science, because after all we have to find out the truth. This is perhaps one of the brief of political theory, this is perhaps one of the mission of political theory, to basically search truth, social and political reality, arriving at truth, because this quest for truth is as old as perhaps human existence and philosophy. But in modern time, because we are equipped with number of tools and techniques, therefore, this endeavor should be there in a much more vigorous way and we should abandon it. So, this quest for truth basically would not allow you to simply say that every interpretation has some element of truth and therefore, all of them are right. So, you have to basically rank them, and therefore, this escape route is also not basically valid. The third is to rank interpretation true and more true, and this is to some extent sensible, because in social science this absolute truth is perhaps out of question, because no one can say conclusively that whatever position, whatever interpretation he or she is giving is the final truth, because after all this is perhaps the beauty of human existence, because human beings and human society to great extent is subjective compared to the natural world, and therefore, there is a difference between social science and natural science. In fact, it is also argued that truth is by and large neutral in natural science, but it is politically partisan in social science, because truth deals with issues related to human beings and that is full of subjectivity. Therefore, this absolute truth is out of question in social science, but in natural science one can claim, but even then we should not forget that what happened to Galileo. for speaking out the truth. So, even natural science, this is a statement that truth is neutral may not be sustained beyond a point, but in social science it is established fact that truth cannot be neutral, truth cannot be absolute, but nonetheless the thing is that the quest for truth is always there as an integral part of this entire exercise called political theory. So, therefore, there are 3 escape routes which I just mentioned, and none of them is perhaps helpful in terms of dealing with this interpretation. Now, then the question arises that how to approach a thinker or how to approach a text, and that basically brings us to the question or techniques of interpretation, because of course there are number of regions due to which this interpretation varies, the changes. One is of course the growth of knowledge, no one can deny it, that over the period of time people have become more wiser. So, there is a growth of knowledge, and that is the evolutionary process, the way society is evolving, human beings are evolving, ideas are evolving. So, of course, the growth of knowledge is there. And then of course, the conditions, social conditions also impact knowledge. So, these 2 factors are there both in the creation of text, in the interpretation of text, but nonetheless the techniques of interpretation are important so far as this question of dealing with interpretation is concerned, because escape route is basically no solution, as we saw that 3 escape routes which can be adopted, calling every interpretation true, or reading only one commentary, or reading one interpretation and considering that to be the de-interpretation, and then so on and so forth. So, therefore, we have to basically think in terms of the techniques or the strategies of interpretation, because 2 things are there. You cannot escape reading or dealing with a text and a thinker. Number 2, the mere engagement with a thinker and the text would lead to certain problems of interpretation, and therefore one has to strategize, one has to devise tools and techniques, the methods of interpretation. Now, the question how to approach a thinker. Now, first of all, there are certain commonsensical ways through which one can approach a thinker. For example, that commonsensical approach sometimes becomes very valuable for this exercise of interpretation. For example, while dealing with a philosopher or a thinker, one should try to understand his or her psychology, and that psychology sometimes comes through the expressions, through communications and through writings. The next thing we should also be careful is to see the life and the biography of a thinker and the text. Sometimes biography of the thinker becomes quite useful and helpful, but the biography of text is equally important, that in what context that biography was created, and that is perhaps the sociology of the knowledge, ideas, which basically get shaped in form of a text. So, that biography, the life, conditions and other things of the creator of that text or the thinker sometimes are very useful. Then you have the social conditions of ideas, that under what conditions those ideas emerged. For example, if Plato was critical of democracy, then one has to find out that what were the social conditions, political conditions of that period, which basically made Plato so critical of democracy. For example, if Hobbes was writing his Leviathan and talking about a powerful state, or trying to basically define a kind of sovereignty which in course of time became popular as monastic theory, in fact one should find out that the conditions which were prevalent at that time, and that condition, for example, the civil war in England, perhaps determined to large extent Hobbes' ideas, which normally you find in his text Leviathan. For example, if Plato was critical of democracy, then one should forget the context, the conditions prevailing in that period, when Plato's teacher, his philosopher, role model Socrates was poisoned, and basically his entire criticality which developed vis-a-vis democracy was largely influenced by the fact that the kind of treatment which was meted out to Socrates perhaps did not go down well with Plato. So, therefore, the conditions shaped the entire text that is called Republic, and his entire ideas in his ideal state, including his take on democracy. So, therefore, These things are important. The psychology of the creator, the thinker, text writer, then you have to see the biography of both the thinker as well as the text, and then third, of course, the social conditions. Now, of course, why we have different interpretations? One thing is there that the text emit number of meanings, and those meanings sometimes are sought to be captured by interpreter. Whether those meanings are truthful to the ideas which the particular thinker was trying to champion or not is matter of conjecture and speculation, because the thinker does always remain with you, and therefore you have to simply basically rely on his written words, and those written words you are trying to capture the meaning which were basically put on those words by the thinker, and therefore it remains an act of conjecture and speculation. But nonetheless, with the help of this social science techniques and tools, what we try to normally do, that we try to be truthful to the ideas basically which are there in the text. Now, why this interpretation? Difference in interpretation happens, and that also is important to remember, because once we diagnose the problem correctly, if you basically understand the causes of the problem, then perhaps it will be easier to be careful while dealing with this issue, or at least it will help you in at least basically overcoming some of the problems which may confront you in future while dealing with a text or a thinker or engaging with this act of interpretation. Now, the factors which are normally responsible for differing interpretations, there are 3-4 important factors, but to begin with, the most important factor is a philosophy, the philosophical predisposition of human beings, and therefore everyone, as it is said, that has a philosophy of his or her own. In fact, this adage goes that there is no one in society so poor that he does not have a philosophy, and no one is so rich that he can basically get away without having a philosophy. So, philosophy is must. Everyone has his or her own philosophy. Now, that philosophy is to be seen as the most general way of looking at things, and this is how people try to, perhaps people's engagement, human beings' engagement with nature materializes. This engagement happens in terms of this philosophical approach towards surroundings, towards life, towards nature, towards society, and so on and so forth. So, general way of looking at things basically gives rise to this philosophy, and that every individual possesses by virtue of the fact that he is or she is a human being. Perhaps this is one of the difference between human beings and animals, as it is assumed that ethics, science, philosophy, these are perhaps the values, or these are perhaps the virtues or qualities which human beings have, and perhaps animals do not have. So, therefore, philosophy is one of the important characteristic of human existence, that is the generalized way of looking at things. Now, the moment people confront reality, any reality, the first instant reaction is to explain that reality or explain that phenomenon. For example, much before meteorology as a science developed, people encountered a situation where they witnessed or they saw rain, and then they had to explain that phenomenon, the natural phenomena, that rain. This explanation came not through a textbook study or any proper training of science, but it was a natural engagement with natural phenomena, and so is the case with the social phenomena. And therefore, these engagements result into a kind of generalized reflections on these social, natural, political phenomena, and those reflections normally can be called the philosophical approach toward these issues which human beings possess. Now, therefore, what we find that this sort of explanatory process which human beings normally do, that is perhaps the philosophy of a person. Now, what happens that this philosophy starts shaping this entire exercise called interpretation. When you deal with a text, you deal with a thinker, apart from the fact that you are trained, you may be trained in a particular discipline, you may be trained or may be given a particular tool and technique of research and method, but nonetheless as a human being you have your own philosophy, and that philosophy starts shaping, determining your outlook, your views, and this is what normally we call biases and prejudices, in a more pejorative sense. But even if they are not biases and prejudices, but nonetheless that basically becomes your own opinion and perception, which is basically in you, inside you, it is not coming from outside, but as a human being you have that element in your personality. Now, for example, one illustration one can give from the Greek philosophy, Greek political thought, the Grote, the great Greek historian, was writing in 5th century BC, and his interpretation, if one reads his text, one finds that he is interpreting things from a utilitarian point of view, which came much later as a school in Western thought, but nonetheless in Grote's interpretation one can find the traces of utilitarianism, because his ideas are colored by the kind of philosophy which utilitarianism basically championed and espoused much later, but in Grote's political thought you can see the traces of utilitarianism much before its advent on the philosophical horizon. So, what does it show? Because Grote brought his own philosophy to bear on his writings, and his philosophy was basically this utilitarian philosophy, which was his own. So, therefore, this is important that everyone has his own philosophy to deal with a problem, and that basically creates problem of interpretation. And therefore, it is often suggested that the first thing one should do while interpreting or reading a text is to read the preface of the book, and one can see, and one should try to assess the philosophical preferences of the author or a thinker, that what are the philosophical preferences that will tell you something about the biases. For example, it is argued that the weakest chapter in Sabine's that classic work History of Political Thought is perhaps a chapter on Hume, because David Hume, because Sabine writes in the preface itself that he is in agreement with Hume. So, therefore, people scholars assume that since he is in agreement with Hume, which he prefaces at the beginning of his book, so therefore, perhaps that is the weakest link in his entire text, because his entire take on Hume would be biased, because at the very beginning he is saying that he is in agreement with Hume. So, therefore, it is sometimes also advisable to basically state in clearer terms one's preferences and biases, because that helps the author to basically put things in proper perspective. Therefore, it is advisable that while reading a text one should try to read the preface of the book, so that if the author has made clear his or her preferences and biases, then that will help the reader to see that what type of preferences author is working with. Another important issue along with this part of this philosophy is the language, because without language no important exercise of in area of social science, in philosophy, in theory can be undertaken. Language is the only medium through which this interaction, this engagement takes place, because language is the only important tool to know the author's philosophy, because you simply try to decode, deconstruct the language, try to find out the meaning which is wrapped under the text. You try to basically go beneath the apparent meaning, and you try to unearth the hidden meaning of a text, and therefore language becomes important. Now, what kind of language is used by author or a thinker is also sometimes important to know, because the language, the very language you use sometimes carries your philosophy. For example, I can give one example from on the theories of revolution. There is one scholar, Crane Brinton, who tried to theorize revolution, and he did a comparative study of revolution, and he compared revolution with disease. And this language, this entire the use of this word disease in this text tells you about the kind of philosophical disposition Brinton has, because the moment he called revolution a disease, so basically his entire understanding of revolution was reflected in this mere use of the term disease, because for many people revolution is not a symptom of disease, but revolution is a symptom of good health. For example, Karl Marx would call a revolutionary society a healthy society, and a society where there is no potential of revolution as a disease society. Whereas in Brinton you find that he is calling the society where revolution is taking place, or there is a possibility of revolution, as society is suffering from disease. So therefore, one can see that how this use of this language, the idioms, the words sometimes reflect your philosophical position, your disposition and your subjective biases. So therefore, philosophy and language becomes important. Now what happened, that skepticism, which is important part of in fact philosophy, in fact without skepticism there is no creative exercise or the critical exercise in philosophy. Now what we have basically to see, that how this philosophical dimension in interpretation with language and other things becomes an important thing to be remembered, because this is one of the reasons that the problems normally emerge. So along with philosophy there are many other issues which we have to take into account, which we will be basically doing it shortly. So good afternoon. So we have to basically start from where we had left. We are dealing with this question of interpretation, and we are trying to look at the reasons why interpretations differ, and what are the ways or what are the means through which we can overcome this problem. And basically we try to see that there are some ways through which this can be avoided, the reading just only one interpretation, calling every interpretation to be true, and so on and so forth, but these are not very helpful solutions. So one has to find out a better way to deal with this problem, that is problem of interpretation. And then we also try to see that why interpretations differ of the same text, the text having the same set of words, the same sentences, same content, but basically is interpreted differently in hands of different scholars and interpreters. What are the reasons? And while doing so, we basically try to look at this question of philosophy, that how philosophy comes into picture, because philosophy is one thing which is not always learned, but human being, by virtue of the fact that they are human, they are human beings, they possess this faculty, this facility, that is philosophy. And we saw that how philosophy is a generalized way of looking at things. People start engaging with reality, and while engagement necessitates or requires some explanation, and that explanation gives rise to philosophy. For example, I gave example of natural phenomenon called rain, that even without having the scientific understanding of rain, human beings tried to explain rain, and therefore that explanation was part of this human exercise. So is the case with many other things, social, political and other phenomena. So therefore, those generalized way of looking at things I call as philosophy, and that philosophy comes into play when one tries to do this interpretation as well. Now, while doing so, I said that sometimes what happens that philosophy works with language also, the kind of language you use, and in that context I was giving the example of Grote, the Greek historian, that how his ideas reflected or basically showed traces of utilitarianism, whereas utilitarianism came much later. I gave another example of this Crane Brinton's theory of revolution, when he is comparing revolution with basically disease, and I said that sometimes the language you use basically carries your philosophy. So, language, understanding language of a text, language preference of an author or thinker becomes important, and therefore one has to see that what type of philosophy or what type of biases and prejudices a thinker or a scholar is working with. And that is why I also suggested that sometimes it is useful to read the preface of a book, because sometimes if a scholar is honest, he or she tries to basically put forth his biases or her biases at the beginning of the text, so that the readers have no confusion. For example, that way Sabine in fact is a classic case. In the preface itself I said that he mentions that he is in agreement with Hume. So, people have easy job to see his take on Hume, because people assume, or assumption is not basically not without a basis, that since he is in agreement with Hume, therefore his take on Hume will be perhaps the weakest in the book. So, that way this is also one important thing. So, therefore, this language philosophy important part of this problem of interpretation. Now, what happened that some sort of skepticism about knowledge has is important in basically in philosophy and thought, because you cannot simply take everything as given, or you cannot take everything as true. So, you have to be skeptical, and skepticism is a very important development in the evolution of theory, thought and philosophy. Of course, there are positions which would say that either there is absolute truth or there is nothing, the kind of nihilist position sometimes the scholar takes, but in fact that is not the right way to approach it. Basically the right way to approach this problem would be to find a more valid truth, or a kind of truth. If not absolute truth is possible, then a truth which is basically approximate to that absolute truth. So, therefore, finding a correct, finding a better explanation, a truer explanation, a truth which is closer to reality, that should be the approach. Now, what happens that language sometimes creates a problem in basically approaching this issue that way, and therefore, this problem of language has been another important issue in this problem of interpretation, as we are trying to discuss with reference to Brinton and his theory of revolution. Now, Vienna Circle, which basically in course of time graduated to this linguistic philosophy, discussed this matter, and therefore, what happened that because what has happened that linguistic the scholar, the philosophers sometimes treat a social problem as a linguistic problem and try to find solution at the level of language. Now, for the Greek thinkers, philosophy was a kind of a mechanism to arrive at wisdom, to attain wisdom, but today philosophy basically is a mechanism through which the meaning of words is deciphered. So, of course, there is one branch of philosophy which is giving utmost importance to language and reducing everything to language, and that also creates problem, because language is after all a tool that cannot be elevated to the status of wisdom or final truth. Now, what happened that philosophy deals with two different order of things, the first order and second order. The first order is basically things, the reality. The second order is basically word and the meaning. Now, what happens that sometimes under a spell of under the influence of such developments, sometimes what happens, the scholars start dealing with the second order things, that is word and meaning, and that is also a kind of a dangerous tendency so far as this interpretation is concerned. Simply going by the word and explanation or analysis, or basically scrutinizing words or scanning words and their meaning, and this has been a very popular tendency among scholars in social science, and this is another kind of development which should be kept in mind while dealing with this problem of interpretation. The next problem which we confront while dealing with this problem of interpretation is the question of history, the historical context of ideas or historical context of the text, and the text or basically the ideas in which because ideas production of ideas. So, what happens that history sometimes becomes a site of contestation. Now, everything emerges in history, all ideas emerge in history, there is no denying this fact. In fact, science emerges in history, superstition emerges in history, but origin of idea is one thing and its validity is something else. But sometimes the attempt is made to reduce ideas to their origin, and basically that gives a rise to another problem, that is a problem of basically relativism, because different societies encounter different problems, and therefore, the ideas which emerge in a particular historical context, it is argued is not valid for other contexts, and therefore, the problem of interpretation starts, saying that these ideas have to be contextualized, and this contextualization basically leads to the analysis and explanation of that historical context, and therefore, the kind of relativism normally we find in interpretation, that this was true for that period, this is not true for this period. Now, what happens that while interpreting, normally we deal with, or mostly we deal with classics, and one of the definition of classics is that it is beyond time and space. So, therefore, this historical reductionism sometimes does not work with the classics, but sometimes scholars argue that even the classics have to be reduced to its historical context, because those ideas are to be seen in context of their production, that when they were produced. So, therefore, basically the truth is not independent of history, but truth is basically pregnant with history, and it has to be captured that way, and therefore, historical dimension comes into play when this interpretation takes place, and therefore, it becomes another big issue to deal with in the question of this interpretation. Now, in fact, what happens that there are a number of ways through which this has been handled in this this enterprise, that is the problem of interpretation. We will come to it later, because in recent years normally we find that entire problem of interpretation is basically gets polarized between two different schools of thought. One is called textual, another is called contextual, and this contextual thing basically is more or less refers to this historical approach to this problem of interpretation. The next problem which normally we encounter is ideological problem, philosophical, historical, then ideological problem, because ideological problem that normally the thinkers, the authors, the scholars work with some ideologies, because ideologies one can say one can see as ideas which arise for promotion of some interest, because one can deny that the human actions are above interests, there are interests to be promoted, and those interests, while promoting those interests, what happens that this entire structure of thought takes the form of ideology. Now, in defense of the ideas, when scholars talk about or basically try to defend a set of ideas, they basically acquire the form of ideology. Now, what happened that all thinkers, all basically texts try to promote some sort of ideology or other. Now, it is in this context that it is important that while dealing with this interpretation, the way one has to find out the philosophical biases, philosophical predisposition of a thinker, similarly one should also try to find out the ideological biases and ideological predisposition of a thinker. Now, at times we hear that we hear this claim that he or she is neutral ideologically, he is not trying to take any position, but sometimes this neutrality claim is not sustainable, whether one tries to be one may try to be neutral, but nonetheless one in human society or any human exercise, and basically political thought, political theory, social science are human exercises. Here the neutrality claim cannot be sustained, because one has to take a stand on certain issues, and the moment one takes a stand, then that neutrality gets abandoned. So, therefore, this ideological understanding, the ideological predisposition of a thinker is also important. Next comes social science, because after all this entire interpretation problem is part of the social science exercise. And here in fact I am reminded of Charles Taylor, who made a very interesting observation that the social science the interpretation, social scientific interpretations have to face a problem of double hermeneutics, and this double hermeneutics is something quite significant here. How it is double hermeneutics? Because hermeneutics is basically a kind of exercise which is understood in terms of interpretations. Because Hermes was a Greek, in Greek mythology Hermes was a winged bird which used to come with coded messages, and those messages had to be uncoded. So, there from there this entire etymological root of this hermeneutics comes from there. So, this double hermeneutics, that is the interpretation, two stages, interpretation through two different stages in social science, or in in political science, or in political theory or philosophy, the moment human beings come into picture. So, you have not one stage interpretation, but two stage interpretation. In natural science, it would be argued that there is one stage interpretation, that the moment you observe a natural phenomena, you basically give your interpretation of that phenomenon. For example, that sun rises in the east, this is one observation, and you have to interpret it, and this is basically just the one stage interpretation, that why sun rises in the east. But in social science, there are two different stages of interpretation. The first stage, that when you observe a phenomena and then you a natural phenomena or social phenomena, then you give your interpretation, and the second stage, when your interpretation is further interpreted. So, therefore, what Charles Taylor says, that it gives rise to this double hermeneutics, and double hermeneutics perhaps is an important issue for social scientists to deal with. And in political this problem of interpretation in political thought, double hermeneutics becomes a big challenge, that how to deal with two interpretations, one interpretation at the point of original observation, and the second interpretation at the point of interpretation of the primary observation. So, therefore, this double hermeneutics is one important issue to deal with. Now, what happens, that it is in this context that the text author relationship also comes into existence, and in social science this issue has over the years acquired a big acquired the form of a major issue of debate, the text and the author, the relationship between text and the author. Sometimes it is said that when you deal with the text, basically what we written is the death of the author, that we don't deal with the author, rather we start dealing with the text. So, basically author disappears from the horizon, and you only deal with the words which are available in the text. Now, in fact, Gadamer and other scholars who have basically engaged with this issue in a big way, they have handled this issue, that how to arrive at the subjective meaning of the text, what type of role this interpreter has to bring in course of his engagement with the text. So, these are the important issues which have to be seen in context of the relationship between a reader and the text, and therefore, this entire question of interpretation, that is hermeneutics, is acquiring different form in social science today, so far as this interpretation is concerned. Now, there are different types of this hermeneutics also. Normally, it is classified into three different types. The first is the pure hermeneutics, where basically it is believed that whatever is written in that text is final. One should not deviate from that text, and whatever is written there, you should try to simply capture it. The second is the postmodern hermeneutics, where basically it is argued that there is no fixed objective meaning, and therefore the kind of relativism and subjectivity which is there does not allow any interpretation, and the third is the critical hermeneutics, which basically takes a middle position that interpreter has to judge between the alternative explanations. For example, this critical hermeneutics where one can put Habermas and other scholars of recent times. So, therefore, what happens that hermeneutics also is not of one type, but different types, but hermeneutics as form of interpretation or interpreting ideas is gaining ground in social science over the years, and philosophically it has of course a long tradition, but in social science over the years it has acquired a solid foothold. Now, what happened that this interpretation, the act of interpretation is not new to social science exercise. For example, many of us are aware with Max Weber and his famous Verstine method, which he basically brought to bear on his famous text Protestant Ethics and the Spirit of Capitalism, where he tried to capture the subjective motivation in action, that how human beings basically wanted moved in direction of pleasing God, but that action had a different motivation. Action had a motivation to please God, but its unintended consequences was the rise of capitalism. So, this interpretative method has been there in social science, in philosophy for a while, but what we are finding that the new developments which have taken place within this hermeneutics over the years have given more depth to this methodological technique called hermeneutics. For example, this hermeneutics have over the years moved in a different direction, that is called phenomenology. Phenomenology is normally seen in terms of lived experience. Of course, even phenomenology is also in fact is divided at times into two different categories, transcendental phenomenology and existential phenomenology. But I will be more concerned here with existential phenomenology, because transcendental phenomenology basically tries to insulate experience with interpretation, or insulate experience with knowledge and reality, but the existential epistemology tries to reduce basically this entire thing to experiences. Now, this hermeneutic phenomenology of course is a kind of development through which attempt is made to go beneath the experience to find the genuine objective nature of thing, and this attempt is largely on account of the fact that it is believed that there is a relationship between event and the person, and how the meaning is formed in this relationship between event and person, and therefore the experiences as the basis of knowledge is at the center of this entire discourse, which is normally understood as experiential epistemology, and particularly the two important discourses in social science which are quite popular these days, the feminism and the identity politics. In these two discourses, this standpoint epistemology, which at times basically equated with this experiential epistemology, basically uses this this type of phenomenological method of interpretation. Now, this existential epistemology, as I was referring to, basically was of course, as I mentioned, that different type of is a part of hermeneutic philosophy, but the existential phenomenology as it was propounded or espoused by Ponti and others focuses on lived experience, that how experiences which people basically gain through their life, those experiences are important part of knowledge, and therefore the only true knowledge comes from the lived experience. Now, this rejection, they try to reject this distinction which was earlier made between the inquirer and the social world. For example, many of us are aware that how Durkheim, when he talked of social facts, he said that the researcher or the observer or the inquirer should make a distance from his subject. So, object subject distinction was important. But now in this new approach, it is argued that if there is a closer relationship between the subject and object, the inquirer as well as the subject of inquiry, then perhaps a better understanding of truth and reality can take place. So, therefore, what it does that it collapses subject into object. This is something what we now normally known as existential phenomenology or experiential epistemology. Of course, the problem is that generalization is not possible, and therefore, what happens that it also suffers the same problem which earlier we saw in case of some other similar tools and techniques, that is the problem of relativism. So, therefore, what we find that the social science has tried to devise a number of techniques through which this problem of interpretation can be dealt with. Now, the coming to this question of classics, because all these things are largely part of this larger exercise which political theory or the social theory is basically engaged with. But normally this problem becomes more compounded when you deal with the classical text, because classical texts have two important characteristics, that is why they become classics. One is that it is beyond time and space, and number two, the truth which basically comes to those texts cannot be reduced to its historicity, rather they can be helpful for our explanation in contemporary times. So, therefore, these two elements basically make a text a classic, put it in the category of classics. Now, what has happened that this problem of interpretation, as I was mentioning earlier, has sought to be handled to different ways by making sense of the philosophy of the thinker, philosophy of the author, philosophy of the text, ideology of the text, then the social science predispositions and the techniques and tools have also come into play. But what has happened that the two different approaches over the years have basically been in circulation through which the classics have sought to be interpreted. One is the textual approach, another is the contextual approach, and these two approaches are significant for the purpose of understanding this problem of interpretation. Now, textual approach basically essentially means that the language of the given text gives the meaning, and one should simply stick to that. And this text, which is of course the classic text or for that matter any text of that genre, contains certain eternal truth, and therefore they are not occasional responses to the peculiar experience or historical or sociological circumstances encountered by the thinker, but rather they tell us something of eternal truth which was valid then and which is valid now. Now, Leo Strauss, American scholar, originally a Jew who basically went and settled in United States of America, is perhaps one of the most important proponent of this textual approach. For example, he believed that the kind of problems and the solutions which are available in Plato's Republic or such classics in fact are valid as much today as it was perhaps then, because they only give us eternal truth. Now, what happened that as a Jew he migrated to United States of America, and then he was totally disappointed with the functioning of liberal democracy in West, and he believed that the kind of maladies which the contemporary society is facing, the only escape route or the only solution lies in basically retrieving the classics, the wisdom of classics like Plato's Republic, Aristotle Politics, and so on and so forth, and this is how the present malady can be rectified. So, therefore, he repudiated, this entire approach was meant to repudiate this historicist view that it was a product of a particular period, particular situation, that was the Greek period in ancient time, and they do not have much use and value today. So, therefore, in fact, this entire textual approach is basically idolizes or glamorizes the text. Now, what is also argued that the text has to be seen between the lines, because the line of the argument of the author is example, is important. For example, whatever is argued, one has to see that why it is being argued, and one should simply try to go deeper into the meaning of the particular expression or the particular sentence. For example, if we take the example of Aristotle, or rather they will try to illustrate with the help of Aristotle, because Aristotle made a statement that man is a political animal. Now, they would say that one has to see that what he meant by this, and one has to read between the text, but one has the meaning is coded in the text itself, confined in the text itself, because Aristotle was concerned with the good life argument, and therefore good life is possible only as a political community, and this is how perhaps Aristotle talked of a man as a political animal. Or another argument he gave, that a state is prior to individual. Of course, that has to be analyzed in terms of his explanation, which he gave in this way, that historically man may be prior to the state, but logically it is a state which is prior to individual, because human identity is given by the state. Human beings become human only when they are in the state. So therefore, such a way, we have to basically approach this issue in this way, that the true meaning has to be seen in context of the larger structure of ideas and explanations in the text. Now, for example, Rousseau talked about force to be free. Different uses of words are also important in the text. For example, the chain. Rousseau also uses the word chain, that man is born free but everywhere in chain, and so is the usage of chain in Karl Marx. For example, Marx talked of that workers of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains, but the chain occurs in both statements. But then the uses of the term, the chain has to be seen that in what context it is being used in the text. So, but nonetheless, one has to confine oneself to this entire structure which is available in the text. So, this textual approach basically tries to capture the eternal truth, the inner meaning, the subjective meaning hidden in the text, by basically focusing on the text itself, because they believe that that is the only way you can basically retrieve that eternal values and eternal truth. Now, another approach, which is the contextual approach, which is also posited along with this textual approach, and here you have basically Sabine as the first important proponent, because he wrote in his book that history of political theory is written in light of the hypothesis that theories of politics are themselves politics, because they reflect the politics of the period. So, basically this contextual approach is basically the approach which talks of the historicity of ideas. Now, of course, what has happened in recent years, that an attempt is made to find out a middle way, and this middle way has been suggested by a number of people. Of course, Quinton Skinner is also the proponent of this contextual approach like Sabine, but then there are other scholars in recent years, like another attempt has been made in recent years to bring this contextual and the textual together, so that a more correct perspective may emerge on this question of interpretation. I will stop here.
On this note, I would like to thank sir for this enlightened lecture, and I would like to thank you, dear friends, for watching. Stay tuned and keep watching. Thank you.